Welcome everybody to the Turning the Tide Forum, Challenge and Promise of Carbon Divestment for a Post-Sandy Wall Street. My name is Brad Johnson. I'm the campaign manager. Mobilizes people, particularly online, for climate action and accountability. And I'm really excited about the panel that we have today, and I really want to make sure that everyone in the audience knows that this isn't meant, even though we're all lined up here on a table, this is meant to be a conversation. So we're going to have some talk up here, and then we're going to go to have it and really make sure that we engage with the audience. And similarly, glad that people are hopefully watching online and should tweet questions using the hashtag #TurnTheTide, and we'll try to get to those as well. I just came from this afternoon. There was a really inspiring rally about the ongoing need for Sandy recovery 1 year after this catastrophic storm hit and right at the, upturned a presidential election that had seen both candidates either mocking the threat of the sea level rise from the fossil fuel pollution or trying as hard as possible not to talk about the role that fossil fuel industry and the financing of the industry has played in changing our climate, changing our weather, and putting all of ourselves at risk. But the reality of global warming, as we saw with Superstorm Sandy, is something that isn't distant in time or in place, and it isn't something that just affects those who are most vulnerable, but it affects all of us. The costs are not borne fairly, but New York City is a small island nation, just like the small island nations around the world that are disappearing as the seas rise. And New York City, capital of culture, politics, and especially of finance, of the global economy. The wealthiest man in New York City, the most successful capitalist, is David H. Koch, who is one of the richest men in the world and has built his empire on carbon finance. And New York City has had a long history of Wall Street is deeply tied with the fossil fuel industry that has powered global civilization. So there's both great challenges and opportunities that we face, and I'd like to just point out that one of the reasons that we put this forum together is to hopefully pay some due respect to the reality of global warming, especially in New York City. There are still thousands or even millions of people who are suffering from and trying to rebuild from the ravages of Superstorm Sandy, all from New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and beyond. And we have every day, every month, there's another catastrophic climate disaster that is affecting more people. So it's really important for us to keep why we're doing this in mind. And with that, I want to introduce our panel, who I'm really excited about. Some of these are old friends and some of them are new friends. Farthest from me is Kate Gordon, who's the Vice President and Director of the Energy and Climate Program at Next Generation, a nonprofit policy research and strategic communications organization based in San Francisco. And she's long worked at the intersection of clean energy, climate, and economic development, first with the National Apollo Alliance, and then as Vice President for Energy and Environment at the Center for American Progress. And sitting next to her is James Slizak, who is a social entrepreneur, an Australian, an author, co-founder of Peers.org, which is a member-driven economy organization to support the sharing economy. He was previously one of the founding executive team members at Purpose.com and a consultant at McKinsey & Company, where he led projects on sustainability, technology, and economic development. And he also is a PhD physicist who is the co-author of Climate Change in Australia. So he is now a New Yorker. Next to James is Sophie Weishoff, who is an undergraduate student at New York University studying sustainability and social change. And she is one of the co-founders of the Fossil Fuel Divestment Campaign at NYU, which is really exciting, and I think it is. Sophie is Bracken Hendricks, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in DC, and like pretty much everyone here, works at the interface of global warming solutions and economic development. He was one of the architects of the clean energy portions of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. He was the founding executive director of the Apollo Alliance and has served as an energy and economic advisor to the AFL-CIO, to Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell's Energy Advisory Task Force, and numerous other federal, state, and local policymakers and elected officials. So those are the bios out of the way. And I just wanted to give everyone here a chance to introduce themselves and to tell their New York story. We'll start with Kate.
Start with a non-New Yorker. That's a good way to do a New York story. Hi everybody, it's so nice that you're here on a night event on a Sunday. I'm very impressed. You know you're in New York when people come to an event at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night in San Francisco. That would be like, you just would not have anybody. It would be like all the restaurants would be closing and people would be going home.
Yeah, I'm going out after this.
Oh, exactly. I will talk a little bit about Sandy, but a little bit just for a minute about my own kind of how I've come to this issue. It's funny, we're kind of a small group here. I used to work for Bracken, and Bracken and I worked together at CAP with Brad, so we all know each other really well. And I really started this whole journey as an economic development person. I have a joint degree in law and city planning, and really came to clean energy as an idea of how to transform the economy and bring in some of the principles of workforce development and equity that everybody was looking at in the economy as a whole. I came to climate kind of late, and now work on it all the time. And Superstorm Sandy was really one of those things that moved me to start thinking about climate as a first thing and not as a co-benefit argument. And my sister lives here. She's a 25-year New Yorker, and was very affected by Sandy. Was stuck in her downtown office for a period of time without power. And I was really affected by it, and also just looking at the impact that storm had on labor productivity. I think there were 2 million lost workdays because of Hurricane Sandy, $65 billion in damages, it's written down, 150 deaths. I mean, really a serious event. And we're, of course, seeing those events all over the country, increasing frequency of events all over the place. We just had out in California the Yosemite Rim Fire, which was a hugely disruptive event, and the kind of thing we're going to be seeing more and more of the Colorado floods as well. And I've really brought my own feeling about economics to this issue and started working pretty intensively on both the question of what this does to our current economy. I have a paper coming out tomorrow, actually, at CAP, with some other folks that looks at how Congress's failure to act on climate change is basically an unfunded mandate. It's essentially putting costs on state and local governments that they shouldn't have to bear, because Congress should be acting. You guys may remember the Unfunded Mandate Act was a Newt Gingrich thing in 1995. He said that Congress shouldn't pass stuff that put new big costs on states and local governments, and we think this does that. And then doing longer term work around climate risk with my boss, Tom Steyer, and Mayor Bloomberg and Paulson. So really starting to kind of pay attention to climate and the economics of climate right up front. And I think that, for me, it was Katrina that really started my thinking on that, and then Sandy really solidified it. So I'm happy to just get a chance to be here and hear what you all have to say.
Thanks, and thanks so much for organising this. People. So I guess my New York story, I've been here for about 10 years, originally from another island, Australia, which bears a disproportionate responsibility for climate change, in the sense that our entire economy is basically based on digging up rocks and selling them, generally overseas. Largest exporter of coal in the world, which is a bit of a shame. And I guess most recently, what's motivated my work on this topic has been a realization that through a lot of the groups I've been involved in helping to start that mobilize people for political action, we find large numbers of people who are motivated by this issue, that care about it, that want to have an impact on it. And they're increasingly realizing that there's something else going on, which is that while we work on this issue, billions of dollars are getting deployed around the world to keep looking for more and more oil, to keep digging more and more coal mines up, to build more trains through the east of Australia and here in the United States to transport the coal. And for me, what really made it the most dark, and why I think the work that people working on divestment, and I guess the whole topic of this forum, why it's so important, I got an email from my mom, and my mom forwarded me a getup.org email, which is like an organization like a bars.org or 350, where it uses online organizing to get people to act. And she was really upset about something the coal mining industry was doing in Australia, the latest outrage. Anyone that's interested, they're about to buy a newspaper because they don't want the newspaper to keep covering climate change issues. And newspapers are pretty cheap these days because they're not such great business. They're important for the world, but that doesn't translate necessarily into enterprise value. And so she forwarded this on to me, and it occurred to me, my mum's about to retire. She's been a teacher for a few decades, and I realised that all those train lines, all those coal mines, all of these oil rigs getting built offshore to dig up more and more oil that we can't burn, it's actually my mum's retirement money that is funding that. And if you do an analysis, as we did at New Economy Lab, you look at where all the money in the world is, just literally all of the pools of capital that get deployed. It turns out that actually most of it is retirement funds. Something like 80% of funds under management, professional funds management, are our money. So Wall Street kind of has a big role in this. They manage it, they come up with the assets, they come up with the facilities for moving this money around. But ultimately, a lot of it is under our control. It's just that we haven't yet developed the mechanisms effectively to let the market know what we want to do with it and what we don't want to do with it. So I'm really excited about this movement. I think it's probably one of the most important things that's happening right now. And so, yeah, really looking forward to everyone getting more and more involved with it.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie, and I am a current undergraduate at NYU, and I have been working with the fossil fuel divestment campaign at my school alongside over 350 other school campaigns that launched last fall of 2012. And basically, I guess, our story, our New York story, and how our work is really central to the Sandy conversation. We actually just this past week did a cute little video. Well, it's not cute. We did a cool video project as a campaign, as a student-led campaign, and we interviewed people in the NYU community to hear their Sandy story and to highlight their experience, because the NYU community itself is very much a microcosm of the greater New York City community. It is one of the largest landowners and was hit really hard by the storm and lost a lot of money. People were out of school for a week. And one story that I think was particularly moving was that of the medical center. And the medical center underwent a huge evacuation because they're right along the East River. And the medical students were telling crazy stories, things like, carrying people downstairs, pumping them with oxygen. These are people who are on life support, babies, things like that, because their generator went out because it was in the basement and it was flooded. And then also sort of like the economic impact of the fact that they lost tons and tons and tons of money on research and equipment, and people's life work was actually lost. A lot of people's 4-year career, all of their research was actually just wiped. So it was there's definitely, that's one example. And I think that what we're doing as a campaign is really trying to point out to the university that they are not, their mission as a university is to serve the students and to serve future generations of students, and that this mission is being compromised by the fossil fuel industry, and that it doesn't make sense to, in one hand, be doing a lot of great things as far as sustainability, and NYU is a leader in sustainability, and then in the other, invest in the industry that's compromising all of those things, and pointing out that contradiction is what we're trying to do. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you.
It's a nice bridge. When we were just sitting up here right before the talk started, I was chatting with Brad, and Brad said two of the things he wants to kind of dig into in this conversation, and I expect that this will be a pretty interactive, real conversation. But one is the notion of how change happens. This is such fundamental stuff that it's actually, it's sometimes hard to focus on the level of change that needs to happen and actually how we're going to get it to happen. And then a deeper question, a fundamental piece of that is how power is exercised. So the whole setup for the conversation today is really about money and power in the face of very, very deep threats that are on a time scale that's difficult to understand, at a fundamental kind of an existential level that's sort of difficult to comprehend. So I'm hoping that in this conversation and in this movement that folks like Sophie and like the rally that happened with 350.org earlier today, there really is an effort to build a movement around this notion about the deployment of power to get really fundamental change that's very strategic. I think there's two things that we really need to dig into, and one is a question of urgency and really understanding what's at stake, and the tremendous threat that is in hand at the moment. And then the second is a question of ambition. The fundamental nature. What we're talking about is very, very bold either way. So I want to just really quickly tell you two closely related stories and then an insight that came out of it. About 5 years ago now, I wrote a book with then Congressman Jay Inslee, who's now the governor of the state of Washington and is one of the greatest climate champions in the political arena right now. Truly, truly fundamentally motivated by it in Washington State, coming from a state living on Bainbridge Island, where he's seeing the change in real time with the ecosystem that he's very connected with and a progressive base. We wrote a whole book, and it was looking at the clean energy economy. What can we build? Where do we go next? And we really tried to tell the story of climate. And at the very, very end of having I spent a year and a half researching and writing this book, and it was time to, it was like in the final galleys, and we were going through and finding proofreading, and we had to get some pictures. And there was one story that we told early on. There was a woman who's a tribal leader in a community in Alaska named Lucy Nengawak, who was having to move at the cost of several millions of hundreds of millions of dollars, move their community inland because the ice flows were starting to melt, the storms were coming in, and the erosion was actually eating away at the foundations of buildings, and they were tumbling into the ocean. And I kind of understood that climate was real and that it was starting to happen in certain places. But we called her and we said, could you send us a photograph for a book? Because we want something to kind of illustrate this. And she said, oh, sure. I'll send my husband outside with a digital camera and I'll just take a photograph and email it to you. And I realized at that moment, after, I understood this very, very well as really, any of the scholars who were out there. But I hadn't internalized that this was about a woman's house. And, just send her husband out, take a picture, it was really happening. So that moment, I really learned that climate change is personal. And it's really about losing the things you love. And it's about a very fundamental personal threat as well as a very global and macro threat. So fast forward to Superstorm Sandy. And my father, who's here, who's actually a alumni of Cooper Union and a longtime resident of New York, lives over by the Holland Tunnel next to my uncle. It's that's our family home. It's home. And so I was watching remotely and watching the water levels move up in the battery and getting to 12 foot, 13 foot, and a high tide came, and the storm surge came, and the water flowed up Canal Street. It was waist deep in the middle of Canal Street, flooded up Greenwich Street in front of our home, filled our basement. My father's a visual artist, and his life's work was in that basement. And so, museum exhibitions in crates that just couldn't possibly be moved were floating in, 6-8 feet of water. And I came, rushed up to, help move stuff. We spent, 5 days. Fortunately, really most of it was saved in a kind of a remarkable thing. But, and it was that one tide. The water flowed in, the water flowed out, and then, it took a week to get the water pumped out and all of this. But it was right during the heat of the election, and Mitt Romney trying to save the planet, and this was sort of a laughable thing. But it was in a particular moment as I was lugging armloads of just like dirty paper and debris out to the curb, I suddenly had a second realization that this is actually what climate change looks like. That it's dramatic, but it's episodic. So it's these sudden, sort of cataclysmic, life-changing things that happen, they hit you, but they're very difficult to prove. But they're a direct result of the climate changing. It's not, our experience, fortunately, was relatively small. If you actually look at what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa with, you have these ethnic and religious conflicts, and if you trace them back, they're really fundamentally about people can't grow as much food, so they're having to migrate, and it's creating this level of friction that's sort of bringing out the worst cultural trends instead of best, because people are so stressed around fundamental life support. So it's these acute episodic events creating life-changing and terrifying outcomes. That's what climate change is. So as we pivot here and we start talking about money and power and how do we mobilize resources to make something different happen, I want to say that the thing that really motivated me, I actually came to climate change because I saw it as an organizing principle that really brings people together across division. And I saw it as a kind of a direct outcome of really, traditions of creative nonviolence, the sort of the thinking of Gandhi, and there's a set of threats, and we really have to choose what we're going to do about them. And stopping something bad from happening is actually not the same as doing something good. So this is the final kind of realization, and then sort of open it up. But in the process of of writing the book and talking about climate change, I realized that climate change is a very, very different challenge from most of the things we're used to. Because usually if you do nothing, the world stays the same. But the status quo is not an option. So doing nothing means we're accepting a really gut-wrenching climate crisis. To have things stay the same actually means taking very, very profound and significant action. And this is where money and power come in a very profound way. We're at a crossroads where we either will unquestionably get life-altering climate change and climate crisis because we did nothing, or we will do something very specific, which is knowable. We'll marshal hundreds of billions on an annual basis into rebuilding all of our infrastructure, rebuilding our homes, our offices, our transportation systems, and rethinking how we produce and consume wealth. And that's really the only option. So we're at this point. So then this question of divestment from fossil fuels is critical to achieving that. That's equivalent to stopping doing harm, which is critically important. It's half of the story. The second is how do we build the future we want? And that's a reinvestment agenda. And it involves mobilizing pension funds, is a great example. Trillions of dollars of assets in the retirement income, the deferred savings of workers. So that's the question, I think.
So I'm gonna, because I don't want to take up all the exciting things we're going to get to talk about. And but so these are some really amazing, like, I mean, kind of we did kind of touch up on so much here. But one thing that I think everybody hinted at, and I think plays a role, and because I do want to kind of try to keep pulling it back to New York City, just kind of like, you know, like if our only agenda is to save New York, like, what do we have to do? And to that, like, and if you look at Wall Street, one thing that's really striking to me, you know, if you flick on CNBC, if you look at the Wall Street Journal, if you look at the culture of Wall Street, the culture of financiers, in other words, the culture of the people who are deploying the pension funds, it's a culture in which rejecting the science of climate change isn't just like, okay, it's actually actively done. It is, in fact, kind of, I think, seen to be more culturally appropriate if you work on Wall Street to, you know, mock which was, it's global warming, stupid. Like, it isn't just nerds in lab coats that are telling you that burning hundreds of billions of tons of carbon-based fuels is altering the chemistry of the atmosphere. But, so I guess one thing is, like, that's kind of the obvious culture, and obviously buying, when you have fossil fuel companies explicitly trying to buy or owning the media is a big part of it. But I'm wondering, and also, I'm just kind of wondering what people think about that question of, like, are there people on Wall Street who reject that? And also, like, how do we change, you know, the culture of how we view finance? And does that make sense? Kate?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that for a second, because the project that well, let me actually start by saying one reaction I had to Bracken is there's this great Ernest Hemingway quote when he was asked how it is that he managed to go bankrupt, and he said, 2 ways, very slowly, and then all at once. And I almost feel like that sort of epitomizes the climate change discussion also. But I want to talk for a second, because it's directly responsive to Brad, about this project that we're doing at Next Generation, but we're really staffing it. It's the project of the co-chairs of the project, and Mayor Bloomberg is one of them. The reason he's involved in this is Superstorm Sandy. So it's a very New York story in a way, and it's also a project that's directly trying to get to the question that Brad just asked. So we have put together, or we're staffing a project, I'm directing a project that Tom Steyer, who is a former hedge fund manager out in San Francisco, the largest hedge fund in California for capital, who's now become a climate activist. You've probably seen stories with him. He founded Next Generation. I work closely with him. Mayor Bloomberg, of course, you all know. And Hank Paulson, who was the former Treasury Secretary under George Bush, have come together as co-chairs of a project that we're calling Risky Business, that is essentially a project organized around the idea that if the U.S. were a business, if it were a well-run business, we would have a risk committee figuring out what our risk is from climate change. That right now we don't know the answer to the question of what kind of quantitative answer to the question of what risk we're facing. So we can't ask people to react to that risk because we don't know what it is. So essentially what we're doing is those three who have a huge amount of credibility in the financial world. We also have Bob Rubin involved, George Schultz is involved, a number of other people are involved. But we have 3 former Secretary of Treasury, with Schultz, Rubin, and Paulson. Their credibility in asking this basic question, essentially what they're saying is, look, we're not the people you pat on the head and say, oh, climate change, that's something we can think about, you know, when we have time, if we're environmental activists. Real business people, if we're doing what we do as investors and leaders of the economy and people who give advice to world governments, we need to understand this risk, and how you react to it is your decision. So you may have a different risk appetite if you're in a boardroom, if you're in a city, if you're at a public utility commission, if you're in different parts of the United States. Your risk appetite and your response may be different, but you have to know what the risk is. So that project is 100% designed to get at this question that Brad just asked. And I have to say, we've been, we designed it to involve nobody from any environmental organization, which is controversial, but I think was helpful in putting it together, and also not to go to solutions. And just an interesting thing about the project is that in terms of the Republicans that I've talked to who have become involved, all of them have said to me, I've been looking for a way to get involved in this issue, and the science conversation and the solutions conversations are so partisan and divisive that I haven't been able to figure out a way to engage, and this is a way to engage. So I think
can't
there's something
imagine
in
how that became a partisan and divisive
there's,
conversation.
I mean, and so what these guys are saying is, and Hank Paulson was really strong on this when we started the program. He said, I don't want to do this if we're going to debate the science. Because if I was back at Goldman and 97% of scientists said something was real, we would have a risk committee look at it. So we're starting from that assumption, and it's just been very interesting to recast this in completely different terms and have that conversation, and we're hoping it has an impact, but it's been really exciting.
Sophie, has the NYU divest, or I don't know if you know any other stories, but when you're talking with, or have you gotten to interact with the management of, I mean, because it seems like this is really, like in a basic sense, the Student Divestment Act really does seem kind of not, it doesn't seem like rocket science, like, you know, and if there's anybody who's supposed to be in the business of looking out 20, 30 years, 50, 100 years into the future, universities would seem to be that. Universities they all employ, this is where the world's climate scientists, work. Some of the top scientists in the climate scientists in the world work at NYU. It seems like you wouldn't face this like, oh, well, no, I mean, it's like the professors are the ones who are writing the articles that are saying that fossil fuels are a toxic acid.
They don't run the endowment fund.
Well, and that's what I'm wondering. It's like, have you talked with what has that been like? I mean, how are they able to say? That's what I'm really wondering. Is like, how can somebody who's running an endowment fund say, we disagree with our own people? We think this is not a toxic asset. We think it's a great asset.
Yeah. It's funny. So Brown University just their board. We haven't gotten to our board yet. We're still in the process of going through the student senate, faculty senate, and university senate, which then pushes up to the board. They're actually Brown divest coal, so they're only asking for divestment from coal, and they just the board was supposed to tell them on Friday, and then was supposed to tell them yesterday, and then finally this morning came out with their decision on divestment and gave them a no. And this has been really, really common. The only schools that have committed to divestment so far are very small liberal arts schools with very small endowments. A lot of these schools are actually more environmentally inclined and so the college in Maine that divested is an environmental school. So it's interesting. I think that the university system, the higher education system today, is very much tainted by corporate influence. It's tainted by the same kind of power structures that we see in the larger society, where the people who matter, essentially, do not have control over issues that affect them. The faculty and the students who are doing all of this amazing research and who care about these issues and who voice their opinions on these issues, not only the climate change issue, but many, many other issues, are not the ones who control the endowment and are often not heard or listened to. And the people who do control the endowment are administrators, and they are part of that power dynamic. And the student campaigns are one way of shifting that power dynamic.
And James, you've kind of been on, I feel like in your experience, you've been on all of these sides. You've been the corporate consultant, you've worked on mobilizing people, you've been a science, you yourself have kind of played all of these different roles. And I want to start transitioning to the audience. So I'm going to ask you to encapsulate all of this in the bit, like, what, I mean, how, for example, like, how do you put on these different hats?
Yeah.
And like, is there a way for, you know, the climate scientist hat and the financier hat and the activist hat to actually be worn by the same person in the same community?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I found the most surprising is how much taking the lens of one of these guys in the tall buildings understand reality, how unhelpful that has been for my own work. That actually there's like a systemic problem here, which is that, you know, Wall Street is a bunch of guys sitting around crunching spreadsheets. And actually it kind of doesn't matter too much, in my view, maybe to be a little bit controversial, you know, precisely what their assessment is of a bunch of stuff that's a little bit outside of their ability to, you know, form an expert judgment, right? They're not scientists. But they move in herds. You know, this is why we had the housing bubble. This is why, you know, the Dutch had the tulip bubble. And right now, the herd says that society is not acting on climate change. And so the herd says fossil fuel investments are good investments. I think part of the way to reach them is that, you know, herds kind of change directions all at once, but there's a couple that break away that starts that. And I think, you know, why what Sophie's doing, why this divestment stuff is so important, is because those guys crunching the spreadsheets, when they start to see a few larger funds start to consider these issues, maybe California Endowment, you know, retirement funds start to move some of their money away, suddenly those spreadsheets look a little bit different. There's a few little footnotes at the bottom of the analyst reports, there's a few more meetings to look into these kind of risks that have come up, and I feel like, you know, that's where the power of this movement is, because if we can convince them, in a sense, that society wants to really revoke the social license of these businesses, they become bad investments. And therefore, you know, I don't care what their view about physics is, frankly. It's not interesting to me. We need to make these bad investments, and I think we can do that.
I mean, I'm going to push back on that for a second, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, that, you know, the fossil fuel industry needs to be wound down over the next few decades to zero. There are literally unburned fuel, that's on the books, and there was the valuation of these companies. And you're talking even, you know, nations, is tied up in the idea that these are assets. They're not something that needs to stay in the ground. So which means that if there's basically there's no kind of, as long as you're willing, if you're to put your profits above the interests of like society, there's kind of no reason for you not to spend 1%, 10%, 50%, even 80% of those assets to protect them. And, you know, and it doesn't, if you have a net worth of $45 billion, like David Koch does, you really only need to spend, and also you get the benefit of tax benefits of spending on, you know, nonprofit film crews. You only need to spend like a few $100 million a year has a really, you know, can have a really big impact on our political process.
Buying elections is cheap, you know, relative to the.
Right. And so that's, I guess that's what I'm saying, is like, is our only answer that we need to have like good billionaires to offset the bad ones, or is there something deeper than that? I see. Oh, I think I got. So this is kind of, I want to have a kind of a rapid fire response here. I think I've gotten everybody here scoped out. So we're gonna go bracket all the way down to Kate.
Go ahead.
But you have to. Genuinely, this is. I'm going to people on the clock here.
Sure. I think it's important to look at the point about risk is really critical to understand. We need to spend a few minutes kind of teasing out, or a few seconds, whatever. We need to spend some time teasing out. There are investors who are, you know, authentically immoral. You know, there are folks who are trying to line their pockets. The Koch brothers, who are doing something that I think they probably believe is quite is at some level dangerous, and they're rationalizing, they're spending a lot of political money to make it possible. I think they're in the extreme minority. I think the vast majority of investors and fund managers and folks are kind of amoral. They're not doing this from a moral posture at all. They're managing within a set of rules. And they're given a set of rules, and those rules tell them what the risk is and what the opportunity is, and they're optimizing according to those rules. And that's really where the preponderance of Wall Street is. And if you know anything about markets, you know that markets are really efficient within the rules, and if you get the rules wrong, they'll careen in an irrational or dangerous direction. And that's the fundamental problem, is that we have rational managers working with incomplete information without a moral focus. So to say somehow that they should be trying to fix, let me get to the third point.
That was a great.
So, but then the third group, there is a group of folks who are actually ethical. They're investment managers. They're not immoral. They're not amoral. They're trying to do the right thing. And I think CalPERS and CalSTRS, the pension funds in California, they have trillions of dollars in assets. They represent union teachers and public employees, firemen and cops, and they've got trillions of assets, and they want to invest in stuff that creates jobs, that is good for the domestic economy, and they've carved out clean energy and infrastructure as a significant piece of their portfolio. It's actually hard for them, under the existing rules, to find the right investments to park hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. So they have a need for products built around green under ERISA that says their hands are tied. They can't take pensioners' retirement savings and invest it speculatively on something that sounds good but maybe a bad investment. So we need to come at this from two different vantage points. We need to make it a better investment to do the right thing. And some of that's from making it really hard to do the wrong thing. And recognize that actually investing in fossil fuels represents serious pools of stranded assets, and it's a very bad investment. But the amoral folks are not recognizing that they're potentially risking all of these investments that they're putting out there right now. And so those campaigns are really important, but there's a separate piece to make new investments possible.
Yeah, so that's all stuff that's really out of my league. I don't know. I mean, I can't speak to all of the like sort of financial side and like the money manager side of things, because that's not where I can speak from. But I can speak to just like that question of, should it just be more good billionaires? I think that the problem is very systemic, and like I hate to like go back to that because everyone always goes back to that, but I think that when we're reinvesting, it's not about like opening the divestment demand and therefore the reinvestment demand is a way of addressing, stopping and then rolling into something new, but it's opening up a deeper political discussion, opening up doors for things that I'm really excited about with stuff like new economics and all of these things that are coming forward that are changing the way that the system runs, and that it's not just pumping out more billionaires that are doing good, because I don't think that that's going to solve anything, because it's just going to be doing more good for who, and that, reimagining from the most fundamental level of like how our economy works, and how our society works and the values from which we function. I think that's where the answer is, and that divestment and reinvestment are one piece of moving us in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to reframe it a bit. I feel like we don't need to see this as, billionaire v. billionaire, right? It's definitely true that there are billionaires that have a lot invested, and they'll give, you could do an economic analysis and prove why they need to give every last dollar away before they lose their stranded assets for kind of obvious reasons, right? But I think actually the situation's not as bad as we think. I mean, obviously we live in a democracy, so actually, in theory, you can't really buy an election, you can influence it, but we get to vote about these things. And there have been much more powerful billionaires who've been defeated, even in this fella, at one point, owned basically the whole oil industry, literally 90+% of the oil industry. His personal wealth was over 1% of the entire United States GDP.
It's pretty cool. when he died, the estate tax was high enough that he basically paid for like 2 years of the U.S. involvement in World War II.
Amazing, right? And the irony is, that money's now all in a foundation doing some good stuff for the world. Like it's going to help. It's money that we can tap into. Rockefeller Foundation and others that can help support work on this. So I guess I just wanted to say, 2 quick things. Like one is
foundations that are invested in fossil fuels.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Yeah, we
they are
should
trying to divest. The foundations are.
push them harder to get out, and really they should be the low-hanging fruit to win on this. But I was going to say one last thing about the investments, which is just to kind of twist. I like twisting the knife in the fossil fuel industry. I feel like one dangerous myth is that the BPs, the Exxons, the coal interests of the world, they're kind of just energy companies, and we just need to let them see why really the future of energy is in renewables, and they should be the renewable energy companies of the future. And don't get me wrong, renewables is the future, and it needs to be quickly what replaces these companies. But I don't think those companies are going to be the renewable energy companies of the future. And I think that BP, when you look at what these companies actually do, sort of from the, this is me with the business hat on, and you sort of say, okay, I'm going to place a bet on the future. Who's going to win the race? Take solar, for example. It's like a high-tech semiconductor industry. It's not what dudes with hard hats on, in the middle of the North Sea are good at. And it's not where you would expect money to go. So we have to be a little bit harder on them. And in a sense, make it even clear why they're such bad investments. They're not going to win the race to develop solar. They don't have the right capabilities and the right assets. They need to be wound up. They just need to be liquidated. Their assets need to be just, wound up. And that sounds like a crazy radical point of view, but you can point at multiple industries that the market has just naturally, wound up, from the horse and buggy to, New York's streets were first lit with whale oil. No, it's true fact. Look this up. No one lamented those industries going. The typewriter industry, wasn't the industry that became the computer industry. These guys are going to go, and the sooner the better, I think, and we don't want to give them an escape route. So that's my
controversial. Let me just say a couple things, and then I think we're opening it up for everyone. So just to build on a lot of things people said, I do think that the point Bracken made about pension funds, first James made about the number of funds that are in pensions, and then Bracken made about pension fund risk tolerance is kind of important. Pension funds are primarily funds that are paid out to people who are old and only going to be alive for a little bit, for a while, but it's beyond. It's beyond the 2050, 2100 climate projections that everyone is always making. We're talking about people who have hit retirement, who are very active, but are still not probably going to be around till 2100. So I think it's important to remember who they're managing money for. And I was actually just really reminded of this the other day. I was reading a great article, which I recommend. I don't remember where it was. I think it was in E&E Reports, about the carbon bubble, this whole idea that pension funds are now trying to start to convince oil and gas and coal companies that their assets do need to be changed because they are hitting a carbon-constrained world, and they need plans for what that's going to mean for their long-term assets. And one of the companies that's leading in that has the great name of the Scottish Widows Association, which I think is so evocative. If the Scottish widows are out there, asking for pension fund reform, we should all be out there asking for pension fund reform. So I think that's that's a really important move in my mind, because it's kind of controversial, or it goes against what James said. They're trying to get these companies to look at reality and look at the risks and think about their long-term plans, because these are the companies with whom they're currently invested. And they're invested for and paying out checks to people who are alive right now who need those checks today. So it's a very short-term response, but it's actually a very important response. So that's the one point. The second point on similar is, I keep asking the same question you were asking, is the right thing just to liquidate these assets? Regardless of whether that's possible. And I am not as convinced, frankly. Yes, on the electricity side, we're getting extremely diversified solar and wind. We're plugging things into the wall, and different power sources are coming into that. Transportation is not a diversified sector. It's 97% still powered by petroleum. The single largest investors in alternative fuels, not just ethanol, but cellulosic, some of the electric car companies, some of the new sort of enzyme companies and sustainable biomass, the single largest investors in those are oil companies. So you are talking about potentially a transformation. I'm not saying that they have any economic incentive to do it at all right now, But I do think you've got to separate transportation from electricity in terms of sort of where we are and our ability to have a complete new set of companies come in and control the market. And the final thing I'll say, just in defense of good billionaires, because I work with one, is the thing about billionaires, and Tom Steyer, like many others, Bloomberg as well, have taken the giving pledge or giving away more than half of their assets before the end of their lifetimes. The thing about billionaires is that they have a very high risk tolerance, unlike the Scottish widows. So they can be out there doing crazy things, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing if it sticks. And I think there is a place for that. I think the American philanthropic community has gotten far too risk averse and far too tribal, and that there's a place for these interesting, innovative, entrepreneurial guys to be, mostly guys, sorry, but to be out there trying stuff and seeing if it works. I think it's a good sign.
One thing that I was reminded is that, like, when we're talking about companies, when we're talking about pension funds, when we're talking about people, and when we're talking about retiree, the pension funds, everyone, we're grandparents, we're New Yorkers, we're Americans. We have so many connections to each other, and I feel like one of the fundamental challenges in terms of how do we create a better world is recognizing what the connections that we want to be focusing on and building. In other words, pretty much all the world leaders are parents and grandparents. Like all the CEOs of companies, all the presidents and world leaders, they have children, they have grandchildren, and so they're fundamentally and the power of, and it's that type of thing, everybody has a connection. New York is a place of, it's a place of myth and as much as it's and, in buildings and people. Do we have a mic to go around for questions? I'm going to ask I think we do. If that is true, then there will be. What we're going to do is we're going to take one of the mics up on the table, and it'll magically become mobile. And so, if anybody has questions just raise your hand, and we will go to the gentleman in the back.
Just say your name and question, please.
And I'm going to. We have approximately half an hour here, and I want to have some time to wrap up. So I'm going to ask. I want to hear people's stories, but I will be a somewhat cruel moderator if it doesn't trend towards a question. or a pithy comment that can be tweeted.
My name is Christopher Pelham. I have two quick questions, if you allow me.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to be mean, but that's what happens with the first person.
Question one, what can we learn from the divestment of South Africa that we can apply to this? And I haven't heard one word really about what public embarrassment and grassroots pressure can do to further incentivize fund managers from divesting. And question two is, what can we do to speed up the point at which fund managers would start losing money by keeping their money in? Because I have a feeling that they're not pulling their money out yet because they feel like they can leave it in a little longer. They can still milk it and then get out safely. And we have to do something about that.
I just want to hit on that first question just really briefly, it kind of goes to what Bracken's saying is like the immoral, the amoral, and the ethical is, the divestment campaign really is, one of the powerful things about it is that it is deliberately modeled the lessons of the anti-apartheid divestment campaign, and it's modeled on like the abolitionist movement here in the United States when we were faced with immoral economic systems. And like, for example, it was really inspiring to have Desmond Tutu, being one of the leading voices in support of the fossil-free divestment movement. And you're not going to reach the immoral people with that. You will empower the ethical people. And I think one of the things that you reach is that most of the kind of amoral and the people who kind of do their jobs without considering the morality, most of them are actually fundamentally moral people. And this is a way to reach them and let them understand that just following the rules has moral implications. And once you learn that, then you have the choice as a moral person. You actually have to make a moral choice. It makes sense that, you think that following the rules, like, means that you're not doing bad things. And it's a really powerful, it's a really hard thing to, like, genuinely to learn that the society that you grew up in, the rules that you write, like.
That's the number one argument that you hear that we've been hearing from board members and presidents at universities about divestment, and saying that the endowment is not a political tool. And so that's, as much as that is reaching the investors on like an ethical or moral level, it's also challenging the assumption of the university administrations that the endowment is inherently moral by sticking with the status quo, or exactly what you're saying.
This is one of the most important topics, but I'm going to move to the second half. Is there anybody who wants to take on that question of, like, how do you actually make it a bad investment?
Well, just both really quick, and then I'll let it to others. First, the question about grassroots, sort of the connection between grassroots and the financial side. I actually think Gasland was a really interesting example of that. So Gasland came out, the movie about fracking, and really sort of seeded a movement about fracking. I was at an Atlantic philanthropies event, very small dinner with the head of refining at Exxon soon after it came out, and he brought it up as a concern to their business model and their investors about the instability, whether the market would be stable enough for them to invest in. So that's an actual example of backlash influencing investment from the largest single company in America in natural gas. So I think it's significant. These things actually, volatility is one of the biggest issues for fossil fuel companies. It is a big concern of theirs. Investing in a volatile sector is a problem for them. The more volatile, the bigger the problem. So
and by volatile, what we mean is the public knowing that it's more, unethical.
Well, in this case, I actually meant volatile and that it blows up.
Right.
But trains derail, it blows up, and things get on fire. But it's also the public sector. The other point is that I wanted to make, though, is that, and I actually, frankly, have concerns about the analogy to South Africa, but I won't go into that. I just think it kind of goes back to our question about, are you trying to get the companies to change or go away? We weren't trying to get South Africa to go away. So I think it's an interesting question. But I will say that the divestment movement is one critical piece of this, but also there's things individuals can do. I mean, in my organization, we just asked our 401k manager to give us a sustainable fund option. They had never offered one before. I don't know how many of you have done that, but that's something you can do. I mean, these things, the more you do these things, the more that we move funds from current investments into renewable or efficient or low carbon options, the stronger those other companies become and the more it disrupts the market. So I think that there's absolutely something to
and this is also something we have to demand from our political and our policymakers, politics, right? I mean, government has to.
We have a few more questions now.
Yeah, and so you're right. So let's go to the next question. And we're only getting we're gonna have a one person answer to one person question now.
My name is Michael Hexter. There's general agreement now that the economy is demand constrained right now. And we're talking right now about supply in terms of investment in productive assets and then they produce something, and then people might buy that. But right now our economy, at least some people think, or most people who have their stories together say it's demand constrained. So in other words, people don't have the money. And so just in discussions of divestment, if you keep it isolated from an entire picture of the economy, where you need, among other things, government helping with demand, okay? And I know that's controversial among a number of people, but anyways, government really is the sponsor of demand in our economy in terms of keeping it up, especially among people who are not billionaires. So anyway.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, please.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, the notion of there's not enough demand for goods out in the economy. This is the argument for stimulus. It's that the economy's freezing up because people don't have enough liquid assets to fuel. It's of this type of constraint that we've always turned to fundamental infrastructural assets, and it's created this huge engine of demand. And it's been true of every period of economic expansion in the United States. The World War II and the New Deal were sort of two halves of one huge stimulative effort that created all this demand, and it built a manufacturing base that then private activity and private markets and private capital were able to sit on top of that foundation. But I think it's very, very clearly demonstrated that it was that public investment and that public demand driver that actually created the opportunity for that private capital to flow. But then you go prior to that, you see the way that the railroads were created and canals were built and the expansion into the center of the continent and the movement west. It's if you really look at it, I think it's, you know, if you aren't constrained by an ideological posture about debt and so forth, I mean, the fundamental data about the value of, you know, about where demand is and how you jumpstart is there. Let me just pivot from that point back to the previous question about let me pivot. I think it's a really important point because there are two very separate questions that we need to get at. One is, how do you make it so that people lose or expose the fact that you're going to lose money off of fossil fuels? And the second is, how do you make it profitable to make money off of doing the green stuff? There's a kind of an activist campaign of exposing the dirty money and exposing the fundamental risk of fossil investments that's hugely important, and that campaign needs to go on. There's a very, very different campaign about building demand for green buildings, about creating market disclosure laws so that building owners have to tell whether their building is wasteful or not. And there's a set of stuff that seems really small bore and kind of boring, but it's technically very important so that people can start making money off the green stuff. And it's wholly different. It can run through this activist vein, but we need to figure out how to start using people who actually care to put their money, like Kay was just saying, you know, I want a green option because I actually think that it's risky to just be saying, you know, the only way to get short-term money is to buy Exxon shares. That actually may not be a very good investment in 20 years.
Next question.
Here's our next question.
And then I'm also going to point out that we've had 3 mail questions. So.
I don't know if they were mailed questions.
I am a man. That is true. I am a man. I wanted to speak to how power is exercised, because I think that's the point of the whole discussion. And European utilities have suffered more than 60% value destruction over the last 18 months, equating to about 600 billion euros of value destruction. And that's because specifically the German energy transition on October 3rd got 59% of their electricity from sun and wind. Did people know that? I want to pose that first question. And second question concerns the transportation, which now, as Ms. Gordon said, represents a nominal amount. But I would suggest 7 years ago, fossil and nuke provided nearly 100% of Europe's electricity. So in fact, over the last 7 years, there has been a transition in effect on the utility sector, which has caused $600 billion in losses.
Yeah, I might just grab that one. I was actually just in Berlin meeting with the Renewable Energy Association over there. A couple of quick things. One is I think industries rise and fall very, very quickly. And utilities in particular, they're called utilities because they're highly regulated government instruments. They're instruments of society. We happen to privatize part of the capital expenditures in order to give them regulated returns. I feel like for an activist community or for a community that's focused on making social change, it's really important not to get overly influenced / scared by arguments made by the business community, especially the people investing in these companies, that enterprise value is affected in big ways. Absolutely true what's happened to utilities in Europe. It's also true that the media sector in the last 10 years lost about 50% of their value too. It's hard to get a job as a journalist as a result. The technology industry has risen 2 or 3 times in the last year, went down a little bit in the 90s. So I feel like that's sort of true, but not sufficient to critique, I think, the huge dislocating moves that Germany's making. And I feel like I want to embolden people to tell business people, so what? They're investors, they have portfolios, they win some, they lose some. And, I think what Germany's doing is great. The energy shift there is enormous. And the fact that they can get out of nuclear at the same time as build up their renewable sector is, I think, a testament to the rest of the world that this, a lot higher ambition is possible.
I think that what you're just saying is and it kind of reminds me of what the speakers at this afternoon's rally are talking about. It's disruption has always been part of our history, and it will continue to be so, and even at a greater scale. And it's why it's just so important that we actually have a real focus on having a real safety net, a real social safety net. Because in other words, right, so what if the industries rise and fall, but from the perspective of the people working at those jobs, it actually really fundamentally matters. And we want to have, for us to be able to combat make the positive changes that we need to make, we need to be able to have a positive vision that we can say we're going to make changes rapidly that combat suffering, as opposed to the changes. Because what we're saying is we're having a vision. If we don't make these changes, then we're going to see increasing disruptions and increasing suffering. So we need to focus on we have the capital to protect people when these disruptions happen.
Just really quick, Brad, I think Bracken has actually written some great work on this, so you can go and find it. But I think we also need to call on businesses to be more nimble. I mean, it's deregulated the telecom industry, and AT&T did not go out of business. AT&T started the mobile phone company.
Yeah.
So companies, utilities like PG&E, like Southern California Edison, are now starting to play with spin-off companies that are competing with Solar City.
After they fought tooth and nail against.
They should be. They need to be nimble and react to the market the way that we all need to be nimble and react to the market. So I do think that we should be calling on. I totally agree with you about what's happening in Europe, but we should be calling on our utilities to look at what's actually happening in the market and be more reactive and proactive about it.
All right, I'm gonna no question.
Anybody else? We have one more question here, and does anybody else want to raise their hand to get on staff? So 1, 2, great.
Hi, I'm Franklin Neubauer, and I think if the divestment movement is going to be successful, you need to get a better handle on the perspective and the role of the investment advisor, the pension advisor community, who advises institutional investors. I wanted to talk about socially responsible investing, and I expect some of you are familiar with Ceres and other groups that deal with corporate responsibility, social responsible investment issues. I want to go back to what I said about pension advisors, because they have a very specific role that I think Bracken was talking about. That is, they're the amoral people who are very risk averse, who are looking at long-term portfolio projections, and saying, well, even if I do accept that investment in fossil fuels is bad, even if I do want to do the right thing, then how do I do that with minimal damage or minimal risk to the portfolio? And there's actually, I mean, there's, in their fiduciary responsibility, they have specific obligations to the clients they're advising, and complex just determining what they ought to do, and then actually they might incur losses gradually unwinding those investments that they do have. So there's the technical issue in a subset of the amoral investor, the amoral investor or the ethical investor who would like to do the right thing, but can't figure out how to do that without destroying part of the portion of his portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, what do you do when the rules of the game means that everybody is going to lose?
I was just going to say, I mean, a comparable thing would be if you were before the end of the housing bubble. I mean, irrational bubbles are just difficult to predict the end of. And so, there isn't a simple answer on it, except that it's about a competing projected worldview. Is this a world where these assets are worth nothing by the market or not, and when does that happen? McMansions in Florida, at some point were worth a lot of money, and then a few months later were worth nothing. Difficult to time that bursting bubble.
Can I piggyback on that? The notion of the housing bubble is a really good example. The way to there's two critical things that need to happen with those investment advisors. They need to see the inherent risk of investment in fossil fuels, and to recognize. I love your language about the fossil fuel as a bubble economy. It's a misperception of the risk in these assets, and these assets actually have to stay in the ground and not be burned. And if you recognize that and you're assuming that they're going to get dug up and burned in order to realize your returns, at a certain point, either we're going to crash and burn the economy, or you're not going to get the returns you're expecting. So you've actually made a bad investment. Clear the nature of why that's a financially risky investment is critically important. The other piece of it, though, is this is in really motivating most of my work now. There's a lot of stuff. The other side of housing is a great example of what can be done when the market isn't investing in stuff that it should be investing in. And if you look at affordable housing and community development, the Citibank and the big banks didn't want to invest in housing for poor people. So some very simple tax credits were created, low-income housing tax credits, so that nonprofits could go in and develop properties that were statutorily constrained. So they had to be below a certain percentage of the average, median income in order to live there. Then they got these tax credits and they traded them into commercial markets, and suddenly the banks have a multi-billion-dollar industry, and so they're investing to buy these tax credits so that they can protect the various investors whose money they're in charge of managing. Again, it's not a moral proposition, but a very simple tool of government was used through the Community Reinvestment Act, through the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, through the New Markets Tax Credit. 3 or 4 different policy tools have created a very, very large market. We can do this again with green buildings and with sustainable distributed infrastructure in communities, the way we've done it with low-income housing and community-based economic development.
I just want to note, before we get to our next question, that I think everybody here has told a story of how, like, a small change can lever, can be a really powerful lever. One movie or one policy change. It really does kind of, that thing. If you, and that's something that I think everybody can do. There's something that, that classic thing. There's something that you're better at than everybody else in the world, and that's being you. Sometimes I'm actually a little worried that, I run into somebody, I'm like, that person's better at being me than I am. But understanding that, we actually have, a unique, each of us has some unique power, and, you guys get to live in New York. I made the mistake of moving out of New York City, and I don't know if I'm ever going to get back. And like that's incredible. I mean, you literally live in the one of the or if not one of probably the most powerful concentration of humanity in the entire planet at this unique time. So I mean, it's just really amazing, and I'm grateful that you're coming here, and I hope that you're getting something out of it. So
we have 3 questions left, so I think
let's
so
stack
that way they're
them,
all heard. We're going to have them all 3 go, and
Yeah.
then each panelist can respond and have a conversation so that everybody gets heard.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I know that this event is focused on New York, but I wanted to ask a question about the recourse that the poorest countries in the world, the developing world, might have for how they suffer from climate change. In other words, there are farmers who can't grow their food anymore, and they don't have subsidies from the U.S. government like our farmers do. And is there a model out there where the world's greatest emitters, China, Canada, the U.S., actually pay back or compensate the world's poorest, most vulnerable people who suffer from our emissions?
We're going to stack the questions because we're near time.
Yes, I'm AM from Occupy Network and Occupy Sandy. We'll go over the 3 things. Number 1, we deal with the issue with the fracking. Number 2, there's another environmental problem. Deal with Mike Bloomberg proposed marine waste garbage transfer sites. The one in Ben Hurst, the other on 91st Street on the east side of Manhattan. The 3rd thing, we have a crippled transit system that has been flooded throughout a little bit along Manhattan and by parts of Brooklyn and Queens that have been terrified since the storm hit.
Yeah. Maybe I think we have one more question.
I'm Cecilia Raymond, born and raised here in New York. I'm a union carpenter, and as far as I know, I was told, when I first started 6 years ago, that we do have a pension fund, and that we can actually pick and choose which fund we want. So I'm definitely going to look into it, and thank you for all the information. I really appreciate that. So, and I'm an active union member, and I have a voice. So I'm also on Facebook. That's how I found out about you guys. So I'm definitely going to spread the word and look into things. And I'm totally against, and I asked the question if we have any involvement with the one that's, I heard something about it going online in November, and it's in Lower Manhattan somewhere, and I'm just like, are we actually working on that? And they're like, oh, we don't know. So I want to check into that too, but I'm against fracking. I'm against even wind turbines, which are, green energy. I saw something on windfall, and I don't think that's good for the city. So, but I'm definitely going to look into that. Thank you.
Last chance. Any last questions?
You've already.
6 words. 6 word question.
Okay. Great. So let's give it away to the panel, and I'll bring back Kate's mic.
And and I want to we'll kind of combine responses and final thoughts so we can get people home.
And not like it stopped me not to have a mic. I'm not going to address all these things because I am not an expert on developing countries. I've actually worked only in the United States, and I really respect and admire people who work in developing countries because that is ground zero. So I hope somebody else will address that. I just wanted to go and thank you to Union Carpenter, Cecilia, right? Thank you, Cecilia. Great. that you're doing that work. That's fantastic. Please do ask about your funds. You guys have a lot more power over your funds than most people do. So ask about them. The one thing I wanted to talk about was the transit system point that the Occupy Sandy member brought up. I do think, and I'm spending a lot of time in California thinking about transportation, because I think we in the green jobs, clean energy movement have spent a lot of time on the electricity side, and the transportation side is hard and entrenched and undiversified and really difficult. But it's 30% of the carbon emissions in this country, 40% in California. So we do need to figure out a way to chip away at this issue. About 97% of our transportation being fueled by petroleum right now. A big piece of chipping that away, a tiny piece of it, and a really important one, is electric vehicles. We hear a lot about that. A huge piece of it is land use and transportation issues, and getting people to be able to live near where they work, making housing more affordable where people work, transit-oriented development, having transit systems that work. That has been traditionally a separate community of people. It's been the smart growth people, the transportation people. We need to get those people in this conversation. We need to go to their conversation. We need to make that all one conversation. So I really appreciate you bringing that up and all the points that were made. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, in other words, we need to, from a transit perspective, if everybody in the United States lived like New Yorkers, we solve the transit problem. We can solve the transportation problem.
Half of New Yorkers can't afford to live like New Yorkers, so
right.
It's an issue here too.
Well, right.
So the solution is opposite side parking on alternate days for the world. Maybe I'll hit on the developing world thing. I think it's a really critical. People living in a first world country. There's a piece of perspective here that is lost because right now it's so hard to get any traction politically on this issue, but it's actually a really important one, and that's that in 1997, when Gore and Clinton went to the Kyoto conference, Gore did, and in the end didn't ratify that treaty. There was a deal cut with the developing world, and the deal said basically, we're a bunch of rich countries that have gotten rich emitting a lot of carbon. 90% or something of the carbon that's there historically, even if right now we're emitting a comparable amount to China, was put up there by developing countries. And we said to them, okay guys, we started this problem, we're going to take the first steps to correcting it, and once we've done that, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about your role in this. What's happened in the 10, 20 years since Rio and then the Kyoto process is we've done nothing. And as a rich first world set of economies, we've kind of driven this car, it's sort of like the fiscal cliff, right up to the edge, to the point where now these developing countries even like China, it may be approaching a middle income country, but there's a lot more people in China than the United States. So people there in China are emitting a fraction of the per capita emissions that we are. Yet China as a country now is taking steps that frankly do us, put us to shame in terms of their investments in renewables and their commitment at the government level to starting to take actions. So we kind of need to take that framing into mind, because at some point we're going to have to make good for what we're doing right now, which is effectively forcing these developing countries to begin doing emissions reductions before we've really met the commitments that we made to them. And then beyond that, you've got these small island states, and that's just a disaster. I mean, we're basically destroying these countries. So apologies for leaving it on a low note. I might just have one little thing, which is a question that Christopher asked at the beginning, which is about the role of grassroots and then this question of jobs. I think that the thing that's positive on the horizon about the transition to renewable energy, even though it involves huge disruptions in the economy, is that you actually get a lot more jobs making renewable energy than you do with heavily capital-intensive industries like nuclear or coal. And there are a lot of studies that show that. So basically, anytime anybody's doing anything that gets rid of coal and gets rid of even gas and puts some renewables in there, you can be guaranteed that there are more net jobs happening than there otherwise would have been.
I don't know if you want to respond to the questions or make some
final
remarks.
I'll make some final remarks. Thank you all for being here, and for you guys for this conversation. It was definitely learned a lot myself, really enlightening, and gave a lot of perspective to the importance of our work as students, because we are meeting a lot of resistance as a movement. Great to hear how, I think that it has ripple effects in a lot of ways, and these specific effects that it has on, money managers and on the financial side of things and on the economic side of things is an important piece, and a piece that we don't talk about very much on like an effects side. So it's really great to hear all those positive things coming out of our movement. And I think that is all that is what I'm going to close with.
Well, the one thing I will ask you to do is how do you learn more about NYU Divest and about
Sure.
the student divestment movement?
Yeah. So NYU Divest, we have a website, nyudivest.com, and nyudivest@gmail.com if you have any specific questions, want to get in touch. We are on Facebook. We are very much on Facebook and Twitter, at NYU Divest, Twitter handle, and facebook.com/NYUDivest. You can also come talk to me. GoFossilFree.org has a lot of information, resources, ways to get plugged in basically all of you can be involved in the divestment movement in a very personal way because all of you are connected somehow to either a university, a college, or a city, or a state. And all of these levels have divestment movements going on. So I would encourage you all to go on gofossilfree.org and plug in to whatever campaign you can, especially if you're an alumni, because the alumni piece is really important for putting pressure on administrations. And there's been a lot of great movement there with like Donors for Divestment and sending in letters with checks saying that you cannot cash my money until you divest. And it's funny because it puts the administration in this awkward position where they like have a check and they either send it back or they hold on to it, and then it's like kind of chaotic. So that's how you can get plugged in.
Yeah, and I actually feel I am guilty of having not yet done that with my alma mater yet. So it's one of the things I'm going to do when I get back to my house. Also, I'm a little bad about, I think there's a rent check that I need to pay.
Tell them not to invest it until they stop.
Yeah, I don't know if I can get away with that with the rent check.
I'm just dying to meet the person who's better at being Brad than
I know, I was.
It's slightly terrifying, but quite fascinating thought. I'd love to meet them. I was really happy with the last three questions and how they hang together, and I just want to kind of try and stitch them together because I think they're actually coherent. The first, the notion of the poor countries, poor first and worst and longest, is a reality that's fundamental to what we're looking at with climate change, whether it's famine or migration or community level impacts. And I don't care whether it's the developed countries or the less developed countries. That's a common theme that is a reality of this threat, and it's something we really need to look at. And I come back to the notion that we're either going to have that negative utopia or we're going to build something different. And so I'm a huge supporter of Sophie's work and 350.org, and I encourage you all to track down the NYU group and any other groups you can, because the fight against the bad stuff and pulling that money back has to happen. I want to really drive home, though, there's a second piece of this, which is we need to know what we want, because it's not enough to know what we don't want. And we need to get very busy building it, and we need to demand it. And this gets into the crippled transit system, right? If we build a transit system, it's good for climate. It's the best thing we can do for climate. It's also the best thing we can do for underemployed single moms who need to get daycare access and then get to work. These things are connected. The solutions to the equity side are connected to the solutions on the climate side. It's really about undoing patterns of exploitation for a poorly conceived concept of what profit is. And it's really demanding a more accountable kind of investment that's actually investing in the environment, in communities, in people, and dignity in a coherent and integrated way. So what you're doing with Occupy Sandy and thinking about it, keep going. Demand that people focus on the pain, but also demand that they focus on what we need instead. And this then, the pivot to the sister from the Carpenters Union and the notion of what a union pension fund can do. So powerful. There are trillions of dollars searching for a home. And I worked on a project to get $10 billion allocation from PERS and STRS through the AFL-CIO. And we worked with the state treasurers. And it was frankly, the way that we got access to that was from the California Teachers Trustee, who was an elected teacher, who was a representative on his pension fund, who cared enough to really spend the time thinking about how can we drive dollars. And they got a portfolio allocation to invest several $100 million. It led to a sort of a snowball. There's now, I think, $3-4 billion that have been allocated from those two pension funds, and they're looking for things to invest in. And it's not easy. They're trying to find pools of green buildings. They're trying to find community-based, but they need a very particular financial product to put their money to work. So it has to have a certain kind of a credit enhancement. So it makes demands on policy to say, hey, wrap this with a credit enhancement so I can put this bundle together. And it's just careful knitting of building financial products so these guys who want to put their money to work can put their money to work. And again, it creates something to organize around. Because, with crowdsourcing pools of money now, small investors can enter into these markets and they can demand and they can put their money to work in solar. You can make your voice heard through corporate campaigns, as a shareholder, as a pension investor, as a worker in your workplace. All of these things are very, very powerful tools, but we need to be smart enough and insistent enough to demand a vision of a future that we want to live in. And it's not enough to oppose what we know is going to hurt us. So the whole purpose of this conversation today about elevating a sense of urgency, but also ambition, I think was critically important. And I'm really thankful to Forecast the Facts and to Brad for getting us together and saying, the anniversary of Sandy in Lower Manhattan is really a time to look at Wall Street and how we can come together as people and have our collective voice be strong enough to make a difference in the face of very large pools of capital that without us are going to make a grave mistake. So thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming. It's 9:45. I'm going to try to be pithy here and wrap up this. The reason that we at Forecast the Facts put this together, one motivation I have to admit for me is when Sandy hit, it was kind of the worst fears realized. It's why I'm fighting against the pollution, the deliberate pollution of our climate. I want people to understand that the richest man in New York is David Koch, and he is deliberately profiting off of the destruction of his own city. And I think, but it's at the same, it's like another way of looking at it though, is that New York City isn't New York without Wall Street. Wall Street is fundamental to the existence of the city. The financial sector is one of the, it's a central driver of, not just the global economy, but of New York. And it's, core to the identity of New York. But Wall Street can't exist without New York City, both as a physical location that's disappearing under rising seas, but also as a community of the millions of people who come literally from every corner of the world, or maybe not literally since the world's round, but that come from everywhere in the world to make, to make this city this special place, where you can actually, have your dreams realized of, in building not just, for me, it's really fundamentally about the power that we have as individuals really only comes to life when we build connections with other people. And, you know, in front of it, that's what civilization is, and it's what New York City is, and that's, I think, the pathway that we can achieve. So sorry for being a little rambly here, but I think it actually gets to this question of, you know, what's our obligations to poor countries, to poor people. It's like, nobody on this planet is poor in the sense of their value or their existence or the life that they lead. But it really does matter who has the resources to survive, and really does matter who has the resources to have to build those dreams into reality. And we all have that power here to share with each other, and to not just survive in an increasingly dangerous world, but to build a better one. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and have a good day.